Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Ask an Expert online chat. Today's topic is using student surveys to monitor teacher effectiveness. We'll be spending the next hour or so talking about this topic with our presenter, Kim Marshall. In a minute, I'm going to give you a little more of a background of Kim, but in the meantime, I would like to ask who's in our audience today. So you'll see a poll come up on your screen. I'd like you to select the response that best fits the role you fill. And then you'll see a second poll requesting whether you have attended the initial webinar on this topic. Last year in 2013, we did a teacher effectiveness webinar on student surveys. So it looks like we have several folks who did not attend in 2013, which is going to be completely fine. We're going to give you an overview of the topic and spend some time together really discussing how this is playing out in the places where you're working. And I see that we have quite a variety of folks in the audience today, hopefully some who are using student surveys or are contemplating the use of student surveys. So you should all be able to get something great out of today's session. I'd like to formally introduce Kim Marshall. Kim was a teacher, central office administrator, and principal in the Boston Public Schools for 32 years. He now advises and coaches new principals, mostly with new leaders. He teaches courses and conducts workshops on instructional leadership and time management, and he publishes a weekly newsletter, the Marshall Memo, which summarizes ideas and research from 64 publications. Kim has written several books and numerous articles on teaching and school leadership. His most recent book, Rethinking Teacher Supervision and Evaluation, was published by Jossey Bass in 2013. He is married and has 2 children, notably both teachers. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Kim.
Good afternoon, and glad to be here with you. I guess you're scattered all over the place. I'm in New York City at this point where it is very wet and very rainy and very cold. So let's jump right in. Why are people suddenly in the last few years talking about doing student perception surveys? This has not been the norm at an institutional level, although I must say that a lot of teachers, including both of my children, do surveys informally of their kids. So teachers have been doing this from time immemorial, but now it's much more of a big deal for school districts and schools. People who are advocates of surveys say that they give teachers good information to reflect and improve. They're certainly helpful for leaders, for principals, assistant principals, deans, department heads, and others, and superintendents. There is a school of thought that they should be used to evaluate teachers, and we're going to come back to that later. Certainly coaches and mentors can look over teachers' shoulders and see this kind of data as being very helpful in improving teaching. And then districts can also look at the data. So what the big question, though, and the pushback from a lot of people in the field is, will students be serious? And I've got this cartoon here. I don't know if you can read the thing there. Mind you, Jensen says the teacher evaluation by the group has yet to be approved. So here's a kid who's obviously being sassy about this and abusing the ability. And this is people's fear, is that kids will be not serious and unreliable, and this is all just inappropriate for K through 12 schools. Okay, maybe for universities, where all of us have been surveyed on our professors, but K to 12, many people think it's inappropriate. So that's where Ron Ferguson comes in. This is Ron Ferguson, Harvard professor. He's now at the Kennedy School. He was at the School of Education for a while. And Ron is an economist, but he's delved into this in some depth over the last 12 years. And his research on carefully crafted questions asked to students under the right conditions are that there is a very strong correlation between what kids say about their teachers and the effectiveness of teachers in bringing about student achievement as measured by test scores. In fact, that first bullet there, students taught by teachers highly rated by students do a full semester better than students who get low ratings from their kids. So the kids, he says, are remarkably serious and consistent, and the kids know. That's a shorter, more recent quote I heard from Ron Ferguson. And in fact, and this is disturbing for a lot of principals, student survey results are actually more accurate, according to the MET study, the Measures of Effective Teaching study, than the traditional principal evaluations. And the MET study, which came out a couple of years ago, this enormous Gates-funded study of teaching and learning in U.S. schools, ended up endorsing student surveys as one of three, sort of a tripod of three ways of evaluating teachers, the other two being classroom observations and test scores. And here's a quote from the MET report. Two types of evidence, student achievement gains, student feedback, do seem to point in the same direction, with teachers performing better on one measure tending to perform. Notice that this is a correlation. Nobody's talked very much about causation, about student surveys actually improving teaching, but notice there is a correlation with high student achievement. So the big question is, why do the kids get it so accurately? Are they geniuses? Are they sort of hidden researchers in the classroom here? And I think one very simple reason is that kids are there a lot. This is a graphic that I put together a couple of years ago showing the 900 lessons that a teacher teaches in the course of the year. So this grid is 30 by 30. So these are the 900 lessons, 5 a day, 180 days in the school year, 900 lessons that are taught by the average teacher in the course of the year. And this is a magical experiment, imagining that we can somehow rate each one of those lessons on a 4, 3, 2, 1 scale, where 4 is a brilliant, wonderful lesson, and 1 is a horrible, out of control lesson. And you can see that this teacher is overall very mediocre. They're mostly level 2 lessons with occasional brilliant lessons and occasional disasters and occasional solid days with the green trees there. But mostly, this is a highly mediocre teacher. And guess who's there almost all the time? The kids. So that might be one reason why student surveys are pretty accurate, is they're sitting there watching their teachers. And another reason is called the wisdom of crowds. James Surowiecki, who is the finance writer for The New Yorker, has written an intriguing book called The Wisdom of Crowds. I highly recommend it. And his theory, backed up by lots of research and lots of stories from the real world, is that groups of people are actually more accurate than the experts if 4 conditions pertain. If the groups are diverse, independent of each other, draw on local knowledge, and the data from the group can be collected. So here, student surveys are a way of collecting that data. And I think this may be another explanation for why they're so accurate. So some of you may be familiar with Ron Ferguson's tripod questions. Here are some sample questions. I'll just let you read these on your own here. These are actual questions from the tripod survey, which has more questions, but these are some samples. And notice that in the tripod surveys, there's always a 5-point kind of Likert scale, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. I think at the kindergarten level they have a 3-point scale, but mostly it's 5-point level. And I love that last question. I understand what I'm supposed to be learning in this class, or my teacher thinks we understand the next to last one, even when we don't. So that gives you a flavor of these very carefully crafted questions that they put together over the last 12 years. Panorama is a rival company run by some young gentlemen who are really passionate about student surveys, and their questions are a little different. I'll just read a couple because it's so small here. How much does this teacher encourage you to do your best? Not at all encouraging, and so forth. So they actually spell out, rather than a Likert scale, they kind of spell out the range of questions there, the range of options. However, the danger with student surveys is raised by Campbell's Law. So Campbell's Law was put forward by Donald Campbell in 1976, and it's a real cautionary note to all of us that when we raise the stakes for any measure, whether it's teacher evaluation, classroom observations, use of test scores, or use of student surveys, there's a danger that it will be corrupted, that it will not fulfill the goals for which it was designed. And here are some of the dangers. Let's say that we made the student survey data a very important part of teacher evaluation, like 30%. And teachers' pay might depend on it, or they might even get fired if they get negative results. Here are some of the things that could happen. What if the kids dislike a demanding teacher? And, in 7 years' time, they're going to come back from college and say, oh, he was wonderful, he changed my life. But right now, I dislike the fact that he keeps me at the recess and makes me do my homework and holds me accountable. So maybe I'm going to ding that teacher when I get the tripod survey or the other survey. What if students like a mediocre teacher who shows wonderful movies? Maybe I'm going to go easy on that person in the survey. What if teachers get worried? Oh my goodness, these kids are going to be evaluating me and aren't as tough, aren't as strict, aren't as demanding as they might be. So you can see how pressure, too much pressure that is, can actually corrupt this process. One additional thing is that these surveys can be time-consuming and expensive. So these are all sort of downsides that we should worry about. So what should schools do? And I'll wrap up very quickly, and we'll get into more interactive webinar style here. What should they do? Well, my feeling is, from all my reading of the research, and I've been following this issue very closely in the last 12 years, is the research shows a correlation with achievement. The debate is focused mainly on using data to measure teacher performance. It raises concerns, and some union folks are pushing back on this. Some teachers are pushing back and refusing to do this. But what if we change the lens and said, what if we use the surveys primarily to improve teaching and learning? And I think they have a tremendous approach. So here's my medium stakes approach, the Goldilocks level. Okay, not too much pressure, not too little pressure. If I were a principal now, and I left the principalship 12 years ago, but if I could time travel back and be a principal now, I would actually say that all teachers should give surveys, and they should be good questions. Panorama, Tripod, some other good set. Maybe we tweak them a little bit. We add some of our own. Then, and I would recommend doing this twice a year. Then I would sit with each teacher individually, and the data can be collected very quickly since it's done on a computer usually. I would sit with each teacher and look together, the two of us, at the data from their kids. And I would ask I would ask the teacher three questions. First of all, what were you most pleased with? Now, this is an important question because the tendency when we look at survey data on ourselves is that we tend to look at the negatives. And Ron Ferguson, Harvard professor who gets evaluated by his students at Harvard, said that he dreads looking at the survey data every course he teaches. Then the second question I would ask the teacher is, what surprised you? The teacher might say, they say I talk too fast. That's total nonsense. How can they say that? I don't talk too fast. And maybe it's feedback that's surprising to the teacher and important. And the last question I would ask the teacher, and this is just a short meeting, a 20-minute meeting, is what are a couple of things that the kids have said that make you think about changing something? And the teacher might smite her forehead and say, gosh, I've got to get that homework corrected more quickly. They're right. I take too long to get homework back to them. Or, I've got to lighten up a little bit, or, whatever the kids are saying that strikes the teacher as legitimate. And this looking together at the data, I think, is a really good dynamic. And the focus would be on what would affirm good practices, because there's going to be lots of praise in there, and then what can improve teaching. And I really think that for a teacher to get this twice a year from their kids and look at it with a critical friend, the administrator, or perhaps a colleague, that I think that is the best way to use the data, not for actual evaluation, but to shape and improve teaching. Now, some people think the survey should just be confidential to the teacher, and the administrator should not see it, because of course the administrator is going to be getting information from this. But that's an opinion. We're going to ask your opinion on that in just a minute. So there are lots of sources of information for this, and you'll be interested to know that Tripod, which used to be very expensive when it worked with Cambridge Education, is now free. They have a free website where you can get individual teachers can get use the questions for free. Panorama has just released its questions for free, and then I've listed 3 other companies that are doing this work also. These are all websites you can go to check this out. At this point, there really isn't a need to spend a huge amount of money on this. This can be done pretty efficiently. Okay, so how should student surveys be used? What is your opinion after this brief introduction?
So Kim, before we jump into that, I do want to refer to one of the questions in the parking lot, because it goes back to what you just posted on the last slide. Sean is asking for whether there are actual surveys ready to use. And so this is, are there sample items there, sample questions?
Yes.
Or
yes,
are there
Panorama.
Surveys?
Yeah, Panorama has released its core survey questions, and those can be used for free. Tripod has just released a core set of, I believe, 35 questions that can be used by individual teachers for free. That is once a year, with their principal's approval. So if you go to their websites and explore, you'll be able to find those 2 options. I actually don't know the other 3 companies that I've listed there, whether they have a free option. I would think, given the way American capitalism works, they probably are hustling to follow the footsteps of these first 2. But if you email me, if you're having any difficulty getting through to Tripod or Panorama folks, just email me and I can give you email addresses.
Well, wonderful. Alka from Tripod just posted a response there, and she's willing to work with folks who want to access the information. So thank you, Alka.
Wow, talk about being nimble.
So,
okay.
As you mentioned, Kim, I'll move folks into this next section where we're going to receive some feedback from you all on what you feel are good uses of student surveys. We're going to be using a poll to ask this question. You'll see that come up onto your screen. And based on some of the information that Kim shared in the initial part of today's webinar, we'd like you to respond with which one of these responses you feel is a good use of student surveys. We'll give you a few moments to do that, and then we'll discuss.
I left the percent blank in the first question because there's different opinions on this. Some districts are saying 5% of teachers' evaluation. I believe in Chicago, the student survey data will count as 33% of teachers' evaluations. But the basic point there, and if you're clicking number one, is you think it should count as part of teacher evaluation, all the way down to the last option, which is no, it should never be used at all. Student surveys shouldn't be used at all. And then you have a range of options in between there.
So we'll give folks about 10 more seconds if you haven't gotten a response in there, and then we'll show you the results and talk about that. And while we're waiting for that, there's a few folks in the parking lot also giving us some references to other states that have publicized their surveys for public use.
I think the quality of the questions is really the key issue here. Is thoughtful questions that are not a popularity contest about the teacher, but that are actually asking about the key variables for effective teaching that bring about equitable student achievement.
Excellent point. So you'll see that I've just broadcasted the results. And so, Kim, do you want to walk us through what the responses from the participants are and what the reality of this is?
Well, it's very striking that nobody is saying they should never be used, and nobody in the last two options is saying they're too busy, too many other things going on at this point. There's a very small number of people saying students are voluntary, and the data shared only with teachers, only one person saying that. And I think what other people may be thinking is, gosh, if it's voluntary, then the teachers who most need to get the feedback from their kids are not going to do it. So that was not a popular option. We're spread between the other three with, let's see, 12 people, 25.5% saying we should have it count as part of teachers' evaluations. We'd have to decide how much. 44.6% saying basically look at the data with the supervisor. And then about half that number, 27%, saying it's almost 28%, oops, it just changed. Somebody changed their vote. All teachers give the surveys, look at the data with a colleague. And I think looking at it with another person is very important. In the same way that looking at a videotape of yourself, you tend to zero in on little flaws and you get kind of annoyed with yourself, and the same with the surveys. I think it's really good to look at it with a critical friend or your supervisor, and people are somewhat divided on that issue. So these are all the issues that have to be worked out in districts or in schools that are using surveys.
Great. I'm glad to see that no one said that student opinion shouldn't be used. That would have been interesting. So we're going to move now into a more open-ended question. And for those of you who are using student surveys or who desire to use student surveys, we're going to talk a bit about how you feel they should be used and what successes you've had. So you can share with us how your district or your state or whatever context you're working with them, how they're being used, and then what successes you've had.
So this is an open-ended question, and people can type in the responses, and they will appear in this main screen. Is that correct?
That's correct. So while folks are having a moment to type, Kim, we did receive some questions in advance of today's webinar, so I think it's a great time to touch on some of those and have you respond. One thing you alluded to, and of course this is a teacher effectiveness spinoff, talking about how the topic of student surveys relates to teacher effectiveness. So can you talk to us a little bit more about how student surveys should really be used to monitor teacher effectiveness and to help folks answer that question about teacher effectiveness?
I think the big breakthrough of the Tripod Project surveys, Tripod Project, Ron Ferguson, is he really started by trying to define what good teaching is, and he has his 7 C's: caring, control, etc. His 7 C's, which you can look up and Google very quickly. And his questions really all fall into one of those 7 areas, which he has found are the key correlates of effective teaching. Now, of course, there are other researchers who've defined teaching slightly differently, but there's a lot of consensus around what defines teaching. And for example, Bob Marzano has got a whole book about the art and science of teaching, and he's got his correlates. John Safier is one of the best-known writers about effective teaching, and there are many others. And some of the rubrics, of course, Charles Danielson's rubric, mine, Marzano's, other rubrics try to define also good teaching at 4 levels of proficiency. So what student surveys try to do is to tap into that by asking students well-formulated questions and giving them the ability to rate their teachers. So it's not, as I said earlier, not a popularity contest. And I think the data coming out of the Met survey and out of Ron Ferguson's work and the Panorama work is that there is this very strong, surprisingly strong correlation between what students say in response to well-formulated questions under the right conditions and the actual effectiveness of teachers. And again, for the 2 reasons that I listed earlier on, it's not that surprising. One thing I didn't mention earlier, by the way, is that the protocol for giving these surveys is that the teacher who is being surveyed is not in the room at the time the survey is given. So somebody else proctors the room while students answer the questions about the particular teacher. And I think the administration of this is very important. It's obvious why the teacher shouldn't be there, but also students have to be very clear. I mean, let's say a middle school where they have 5 teachers, math, English, social studies, science, and something else. And it's got to be very clear which teacher they're commenting on. And we also have to guard against over-surveying kids. Some kids are just surveyed out, and they get cynical and they circle anything and they don't really take it seriously. So for the data to mean anything, these surveys have to be well conducted and done in a thoughtful way under the right conditions, perhaps spread out over several weeks, not overdone, so the data really tell us something valid about teachers.
Thanks, Kim. Somewhat related to that question, I'm just going to ask this one and then we'll move into looking at some of the responses. In the same vein of thinking about guarding against student responding with the type of responses that we don't want to see, what do we do about students who may not understand or don't define effectiveness the same way administrators or researchers do? You talked about how the questions are formulated in such a way that they're aligned with the markers of quality instruction. Can you talk a little bit more about?
I mean, this goes directly to the fear that I mentioned up front about people thinking that the kids will actually have a definition that is totally wrong. For example, the teacher is entertaining, is funny, is cute, gives them a lot of slack, cuts them a lot of slack. All those things are people's fear, which is why I think it's important to have well-formulated questions that are comprehensive and that align with the research on effective teaching. At the same time, students sometimes come up with things that are offbeat and really on target. So I think that's an argument for having at least one open-ended question in the survey, something like, is there anything you'd like to say? Or, something, of that nature, an open-ended response where the student can really type in or write in some more general thoughts. But I think, the assumption here is that the researchers who have been working on this for 12 years, worked with thousands of students, thousands of educators, had access to the research, have a little bit of an advantage over kids. And I think their questions should be the core of it. I don't think it should be just an open essay for kids, nor that every school should be making up its own questions. I think we need to draw on the wisdom of these folks who really, I mean, Ron Ferguson, I know him well. I mean, he's an extraordinary individual. He's done tremendous work, he and his colleagues, on this. And they, we really have to give them the respect here of using their questions, perhaps tweaking them, perhaps adding a couple, but using the core questions so that we're going to get really good responses from kids.
And just to continue with some of the questions related as we're going, in the parking lot, we're getting the question about what is an acceptable minimum number of students per teacher if data is used for teacher evaluation purposes?
Well, that's a really great question. I think you obviously have to have a critical mass of kids. So somebody with 3 kids or 5 kids or something, I think that would be a problem. But I do want to say, I don't think I've really sort of put myself on the map on this. Well, I guess I sort of did earlier. I really think that student surveys should not be used for teacher evaluation. I think that is going to run right into Campbell's Law. We're going to start getting corruption of the system. So I would duck that question by saying that if I were a superintendent or a principal, I simply would not use it in a dispositive way. I would use it in an informational, teacher improving way. And I really think that dollar for dollar, minute for minute, pound for pound, student surveys might actually be one of the most powerful ways of improving teaching and learning.
That's great to hear. And I like that caveat that if you were a superintendent or principal, you would not. It's good, helpful insight. Alka was able to answer a question related to the tripod survey that Joanna asked. She's asking what's the average administration length of the student surveys you've used. So Alka was able to say that for the tripod, it takes about 20 minutes, give or take. Do you happen to know generally the panorama, or is that comparable?
I think that's in the same ballpark. I think anything more than 20 minutes, we're going to start running into fatigue here. I think that comes down to the number of questions. There is another issue here, which is what about translation? And what about just students reading the questions? In fact, what about students with reading issues? It was suggested by one principal in New York City that I work with that perhaps the question should be read out loud. Perhaps there should be a tape recorder reading the questions, something to make sure that all students have access and really understand the questions that they're answering. So this issue of seriousness, the kids taking it seriously, the kids having the time and the attention, and the focus to really do it seriously, because otherwise the data really are not going to be helpful to anybody. And what if the kids misunderstand the question? What if I was in a school last year where it appeared that some of the students had completely misunderstood one of the tripod questions and answered it backwards. So you certainly don't want that, because that's really going to just sour the whole thing. But I think, around 20 minutes is what we want to shoot for.
So let's move now into the responses to the question about the successes folks have had using student surveys. I see several have not used student surveys, and hopefully those people will learn a bit from this experience of others. I'm sorry, I'm not going to say your name correctly, probably Andu Mlak, who asked a question about the acceptable minimum number of students for teacher evaluation, saying that decision has already been made. So in some cases, it's used for teacher evaluation. But I do see some other responses here. Meredith talks about teachers using survey data in a pre-conference with their principal and then as a data point for their professional growth plan for the year. Andy talks about using them to survey seniors as a type of overall school climate. Rona also talked about using it to evaluate school climate. Tim, feel free to jump in and anything that's grabbing your attention that you want to mention.
Well, let me just jump in here on that. So there's a difference between surveying about a particular teacher's teaching effectiveness, which is what the tripod and panorama surveys and the others do, versus a questionnaire about school climate or expectations or safety in a school. And I'm here in New York, and New York City schools in the last few years have done, I think, an excellent job of surveying parents, teachers, and students above 6th grade and above about the students 6th grade and above, but all parents and all teachers about a whole bunch of issues related to school effectiveness, including the principal's effectiveness. And I think that's, New York City has generated very, very helpful data on that, which is given to schools and is public. And so everybody can look up the survey data on any school. and see how the school did in terms of those issues. I think that's a little different than actually evaluating Kim Marshall as my social studies teacher and giving him a series of scores, in terms of a bunch of questions on that. And I think both are valuable, but they serve different purposes.
There's also the notion here in a couple of comments I'm noting that folks are saying to survey students who have exited the K-12 system. So once they maybe in higher ed, having them survey their teachers or respond to a survey on their teachers, given that new understanding of their college experience. Has that been used? Have you seen that being used?
You mean a college student reflecting back on their K-12 experience?
That's what it sounds like Ruth is mentioning.
I think that's a very intriguing thing. Although I must say, I just finished doing a graphic showing the teachers that actually come in contact with a student going from kindergarten to 12th grade. And the absolute minimum number of teachers from kindergarten to 5th grade to 12th grade is 66. So coming through school, you're in contact with 66 different teachers and often a lot more. So that's a lot of people to remember. And certainly some stand out. Some literally changed their lives. But more generally, it's the quality of teaching across the board that really is going to make a difference to students' lives. The real rigor and expectations and climate of every one of those 66 classrooms or more classrooms. So I think people tend to have not so good a memory. In a way, they would need to have all those names sort of run in front of them and say, oh yes, that third grade teacher, oh my goodness me, or that moment in 7th grade when I was so embarrassed to be called out by the teacher. There's just a huge number of memories involved here. So I don't know. I think a retrospective thing might be a little flawed, although it might pick up those wonderful, wonderful people who really did change our lives.
Another theme I see here, somewhat alluded to, is this notion of multiple measures and the idea that student surveys would be used as one component of evaluating a teacher or of looking at a teacher's strengths and areas of weakness. Can you talk to us about that piece?
Well, that really was the central recommendation of the Measures of Effectiveness, the MET study, the Gates-funded study, was, let's not use just one, because each one of these ways of evaluating teachers has some flaws. It has strengths and weaknesses. And so let's use multiple measures, and actually multiple, by that I mean 3. Classroom observations, test scores, and student surveys. And although I must say I saw Thomas Kane, the Harvard professor who ran the MET study, give a presentation last year, and he was very clear that the student surveys were quite a bit the most reliable of the 3. Now, that doesn't take into account new ways of doing classroom observations that are being developed, and I've been very involved in that effort. And it also doesn't take into account perhaps improvements that might come from using student achievement as part of teacher development. Well, my preference with all 3 is to make them a part of an improvement process primarily, rather than an evaluation process. So multiple measures, I think some people have said, okay, let's do multiple measures because each one of them has flaws, and it dilutes the flaws. But I think if there are serious flaws, they shouldn't be used at all for teacher evaluation. For example, value-add data, and we can get into this if you want to, but value-add data is in the process of being thoroughly discredited across the country because it's so incredibly unreliable at the individual teacher level. So I'm not in favor of using those as any part of teacher evaluation because they're simply wrong and unreliable.
So I think we can wrap up this question with 2 comments I want to refer to here. Sheila and Wendy, I think, would agree with what you just said. Sheila says, use student feedback to provide diagnostic information for teacher self-assessment and goal setting. And Wendy says, seems more like more of a talking point and an opportunity to set goals for improvement. So it sounds like they're right on track with how you would recommend using student surveys.
And I love the comment that came up earlier that this should be part of the teacher's goal setting. If in January you're getting feedback in the student survey saying that this class is just way too harsh and way too humorless and way too dictatorial and so forth. I mean, that's real feedback for a teacher to say, okay, I got to dial back a little bit on that. Got to introduce a little joy here. Got to, or the opposite way, that it's too loosey-goosey. We need to really tighten up here and get on with this curriculum and stop taking, or not letting. What if this kid said there's some kids that are dominating this class? That they're hogging all the airtime and discussions. This would really lead a teacher to think carefully, and I think it's very important to do this mid-year. To learn that in June would be devastating. But if you're learning it in January, you really got time to to change and to build it into your goals. So I think that's an excellent suggestion.
Wonderful. So let's move into the next slide. This is sort of a summary, so I think we've talked a little bit about this, but Kim, I'll let you talk about some of your recommended strategies for successfully using student surveys.
Well, the top bullet there is multiple measures. I think we could also say multiple interventions to improve teaching and learning. And certainly the advice from the principal or assistant principal coming in and observing the class and giving feedback, perhaps parent suggestions, student suggestions, and then looking at student achievement in real time, looking at exit tickets and other. And I think there are multiple measures, multiple interventions. I would perhaps edit that one. Is the best way to look at this, because there's no single way to improve teaching and learning. And teaching is so incredibly difficult and so challenging and so iffy from day to day that any kind of good feedback teachers are getting is really going to be helpful. So the second bullet is give teachers and community information on student surveys, process, and alignment. So I think the way this is messaged to everybody is incredibly important. I had a searing experience at the end of last summer in a district outside of New York City that was thinking about using surveys, and there was some really, really heartfelt pushback from some teachers who just said that this is really wrong. And it was clear that the teachers really didn't want to hear from the kids, that it was going to really hurt them. They said if even one kid was critical of me in certain important ways, like I don't care, it would be devastating. So I think student surveys really have to be rolled out in a thoughtful way, with some humor, with some examples of questions, and above all with testimonials from people who've used them successfully. And it's interesting in this dynamic where I was getting such fierce pushback, I actually asked the two teachers who were in the room, well, did you ever do this yourself? I mean, just give teachers surveys, and they said, oh yeah, I've done that. So it turns out they'd really done it. But I think what freaked them out and what turned them off so much was the idea of using it as a major part of their evaluations or having it be public. And in New York State, everyone's worried about that because there's been talk about making teachers' evaluations available to the public. Implementation, I mentioned, the survey conditions are very important. Teacher not being there, kids taking it seriously, not too many surveys, not too much time. Done in a way that all students can really understand and answer the questions, so you need accommodations there. And use data to provide feedback and coaching. That's really my, you can underline that one 10 times. That to me is the great potential of student surveys, is that this is actually a powerful way to both affirm things that are going well and to tweak things that can be tweaked. So any reactions or questions on that one before we move into the challenges? So now we have another open response situation. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Sure. Yeah. So if folks have questions as we go, continue to post those in the parking lot. We'll be sure to get to those before 4 o'clock in a short 20 minutes. Our next question, and some of this is come up in our conversation already, but we'd like to open a poll and think about what challenges you may have experienced using student surveys in your schools or districts. So very similar to the last question, you'll see a poll box come up, and we'll give you a few minutes to formulate some responses there. And as we do that, I want to go back to some of our registration questions, Kim. We had some people asking about the reliability and validity of the surveys, and I know we didn't go into too much depth on that today. I will refer folks back to our initial teacher effectiveness webinar in 2013 on this topic. You can find that on the REL website, and the archive of that event is there, so you can listen to the whole event, or you can just download the PowerPoint and the associated materials. But maybe Kim, I don't know if you want to go into just a very brief explanation about the reliability and validity of the surveys.
Well, the best person to answer this would be Lon Ferguson and Rob Ramsdell, folks who are working at Tripod and their colleagues. I'm sure that they're listening in here. They're part of this, and they can send in perhaps some references to the research. You know, it really is, and again, this surprised me. I mean, I was not here a couple of years ago. I was skeptical, but it surprised me, the data on how reliable the kids are. Now, of course, you've got some outliers. You've got some kids who are being silly. You've got some kids who misunderstood the question. But in general, the kids get it right. The kids are right on target. And so I think that's, let me just tell one quick anecdote from the Wisdom of Crowds, the Surowiecki book. So right at the beginning of his book, he tells this story about a gentleman in 19th century England who was a snob and an elitist, and he believed that people were ignorant and he thought the rulers should rule. And he went to a county fair, and there was a competition to guess the weight of an ox that was about to be slaughtered, the weight of the meat that would come off the ox once it was slaughtered. And 800 people put in little pieces of paper with their guesses as to the weight. And then they slaughtered the cow and weighed the meat, and one person won. So this gentleman, Galen, got a hold of all the slips of paper and added them all up and divided by the number of people. And the average was more accurate than the winner. It was like 1 pound off. And so it's just an example of how the wisdom of crowds. But a crowd, again, with those 4 conditions that I listed earlier, and I think that's what's happening with the students. They're there, they're watching, and if they're asked in the right way under the right conditions, I think they really get it right. And it's extraordinarily useful information for teachers, for administrators, and for just the general improvement of education. So I think the research is backing this up, is that the kids know.
So Kathy has a question in the parking lot, and this is a great point. If students who have multiple courses, multiple teachers that they're evaluating, and they are required to complete multiple surveys, 7 to 8 surveys maybe over a couple of days, she's asking how consistent would their observations be after the first few surveys or after the first few periods?
Well, she's raising the question that this principal I mentioned earlier raised, which is kids being surveyed out. And I think if we're trying to jam this into a one day, for example, I could see the kids just becoming very unreliable. And yet, one of the big findings of the Tripod project has been that kids are remarkably consistent from class to class and from year to year. So, for example, the value add data jumps all over the place. You know, a teacher who's a national award winner one year is a GOAT the next year. There's huge variation in that, very unreliable. And even principals' evaluations, you know, going from one principal to another can vary greatly. The kids are much more consistent. But again, she's raised the key issue. And if I were a principal, I would be very careful, especially in a high school or a middle school, to spread it out and to make sure that the kids were able to focus and take it seriously. There's no reason why it all has to be done in one day. I mean, I would spread it out. I would maybe once a week, you know, they'd be doing a different teacher, just so they don't get jaded about it and don't, you know, and continue to take it seriously.
So back to the challenges that, you know, this is one of the challenges, it sounds like, the logistics of administration. Andrew talks about deciding, you know, the minimum number of students. We talked a little bit about that earlier. And she also says the fact that teachers will have to complete 2 surveys back-to-back, or I think that students will have to complete 2 surveys back-to-back, you know, those logistics associated with deciding who is surveyed, how often, how many students, those types of decisions. And do you happen to know, are there guiding resources on that? So if folks can find the surveys on Tripod and Panorama, where can they go to answer the questions about the logistics of administering the surveys?
I would suggest going to the websites that were mentioned, or contacting the person earlier on in this session who gave an email address at Tripod, contacting them, and I'm sure they will have quick answers. I can't answer that off the top of my head. I think they have worked in schools for up to 12 years on this and would have good answers.
Great. And we'll just kind of go down the list here. Some of the other challenges, Richard talks about the response to the online survey was not 100%. What do we typically see as response rates for when student surveys are used?
I missed the last part of that. Say it again, please.
What do you typically see, and maybe you don't know, but the response rates for using student surveys?
Aha. So getting everyone, well, I mean, these are actually ideal conditions for getting a high response rate because the kids are sitting in a class and they're all doing it rather than something done after school or voluntary or whatever. So I think the response rate is going to be very high. I think that the bigger challenge is the seriousness rate. You know, is everybody taking it seriously? Does everyone understand it? Is everybody willing to give their full attention to it? Do they trust the anonymity of it? I mean, that's a big one. What if my math teacher is about to grade my final exam, and here I am taking a survey, and I'm saying some critical things? Do I really trust that he is not going to see my individual response and you know, get back at me, you know, in the way he grades my test? So I think trust is a very important thing. All these factors that go into making it something. Because imagine a situation where the students are, you know, let's say in a high school class, are making some really legitimate criticisms of a teacher. Let's say, you know, sarcasm. You know, it makes me cry after class. You know, the way he's so mean and sarcastic, or talking too fast, or moving too quickly, or only listening to the kids who raise their hands, or whatever. And they make that comment, and then the teacher sees the data and just brushes it off. Oh, they're not being serious, or they're lying, or something. So everybody has got to trust it. But this is where I think the administrator sitting with the teacher is so important, really helping the teacher look seriously. And especially, in fact, what I've heard from people who've done this is that administrators who are in classrooms much less frequently than the kids. You know, I mean, at the most, an administrator is in classrooms once a month usually, at the most. And they're finding that the students echo their own feelings, really confirm their own feelings from their much briefer observations. So I think you know, the virtue of sitting with the teacher going through it, not in a high stakes way, but in a medium stakes way of saying, well, let's look together. You know, why do you think so many kids are saying that? And, you know, I've seen that too, so let's talk about that. I think that's the kind of supervisory conversation that I think will bring about the greatest growth from the survey data.
And that speaks to the comments that both Taylor and Ruth made regarding the interpretation, and when teachers see the responses and they make comments such as students lie, or just being challenging each of the comments that they see that students have provided, not taking it into consideration that there are multiple measures. Yeah. The other one I would mention is, sure, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to mention Wendy's comment about this notion, the challenge that faulty survey construction is one of the issues she has seen. And I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you would recommend that folks use one of the established surveys because they have been created, designed with this purpose in mind, and they have been tested with the validity and reliability in mind. So
absolutely. No, if I were a principal, I would not try to reinvent the wheel here. You know, even though I'm good at doing questionnaires and other people think they are, and I think I am, I would go with the experts here. Now, if there's a question that's confusing or that I think would throw kids off or something, then I would edit it. But the beauty of these new public release things is that people can do that. But I think we need to really respect the work that Ron and that, you know, the Panorama and others have put into these questions. That I think they really are terrific questions.
So one last kind of a logistics piece. Does it really matter if the survey is taken online versus paper or pencil? I know you recommend that folks can take the questions and put them into SurveyMonkey to create their own surveys, but are there instances where folks use the paper and pencil version, and does that make any difference?
Well, that can really slow it down because you got to hand tabulate them. I think you know, most schools are gearing up their computers for the PARCC and the Smarter Balance test, so I'm sure the capacity exists in almost all schools to give these online. I think that has terrific advantages. One thing I should say about the idea of, you know, just taking the free questions and putting them into your own SurveyMonkey is that the kind of statistical analysis that's available from Tripod and Panorama is pretty darn sophisticated. For example, this new free Tripod product that allows a teacher to give a survey and get immediate response. It not only gives the bar graph of the 5 levels of response to each question and displays that, but it also analyzes that with similar teachers in similar schools and gives sort of aggregate data on the 7 Cs. They have what they call a flower petal. They have a picture of a flower petal with 7 petals. And it shows on that thing graphically how you do compared to other teachers. So for example, you might have a high rating from your kids on a particular question, but compared to other teachers who are also getting higher ratings, you actually might not be doing so well. So it gives you that sort of norm reference data. It's also important. So I think the sophistication, and it used to take 2 weeks to get this out of Tripod. Now they're doing it instantly, which I think is phenomenal. I think to get this kind of quick analysis at several levels, the individual question level, but also at the more aggregate level, this is really, really helpful.
So the key message there is don't reinvent the wheel. There's no need to do that.
Right.
So we just have a few minutes left. I want to make sure that folks are taking something away from today's webinar and acting on that in the roles you fill and in your context. We really strive to have this be a solutions-oriented webinar. So we're going to put up one last poll, and we're interested in finding out from you what action steps you plan to take as a result of the learning you've had today. The action step you may take is probably something someone else can learn from, so we encourage you to share. And while you're doing that, if you do have any final burning questions, please post those in the parking lot, and we'll be sure to respond to those. Kathy's asking if we see differences in teacher rating scores between elementary and secondary classrooms. She's saying that they did see that difference in their use.
Yeah, that's a great question, because some people are astonished at the idea of asking second graders or kindergarten kids, and it turns out that they give very reliable data on their teachers. Now, of course, at the kindergarten and first grade level, you're reading the questions out loud, and you're giving kids 3 choices and smiley faces or frowny faces or something like that, but an appropriate, age-appropriate thing. But gosh, the really counterintuitive thing here is that all the way down to kindergarten, the kids are providing very, very valuable information on their teachers. And I think this is just one of the really amazing things here about this. I've really changed my whole position on this. And again, if I were a teacher now, I would absolutely be jumping on these surveys. And if I were a principal, I would be getting them twice a year, and for all classrooms, and really sitting and looking, again, not in a high stakes way, in a medium stakes, really let's look at this together kind of spirit, asking those 3 questions. What pleases you? What surprises you, and how are you going to use this to make your teaching even better?
Great. So several folks are asking about the resources. You do have the web links down in the bottom right that you can click. You highlight the resource and then click Browse to. It should take you right there. Also, Andu posted the tripoded.com website. It is in one of our slides, and I will try to go back to that as soon as we wrap up. But there's multiple ways to get to those resources. We will also post in just a moment the archive for last year's webinar if you want to access that. So resources, people want to share the resources, people want to look in more depth at those resources. We encourage you to do so. We encourage you to keep coming back to the REL Mid-Atlantic for information and conversation about this topic and many other topics related to teacher effectiveness. I like Maureen's suggestion that she's going to share the information with instructional coaches to see how they can use this information in their coaching sessions. Great use of the information.
I should have mentioned that too, that I think an instructional coach looking over the teacher's shoulder is also a terrific format to talk about the kids' responses.
And
one other resource.
Go ahead, Kim.
One other resource is those of you who are Marshall Memo subscribers, look in the archive under Teacher Evaluation Student Input, and you'll find a bunch of article summaries that I've done over the last 11 years. This is an issue I've followed very closely, and there are a bunch of them there.
It looks like some folks are, maybe those who are teachers are going to take a look at using surveys in their own classrooms to help them organize and gather some additional information on their own practice, which is wonderful.
Right.
So at this time, we're going to wrap up for the day. I have a few housekeeping things, but I would like to thank Kim, give him a virtual round of applause for your insight and sharing your expertise on student surveys today. I think it was very realistic information and hopefully something folks really can take back into your workplaces. So thank you, Kim.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
If you do have additional questions, you see on the slide right now Kim's contact information as well as the website for the Marshall memo. If you have general questions about the teacher effectiveness webinar series or information on the REL Mid-Atlantic, you can find us at these contacts on the screen. And if you want to continue the conversation on this topic or other topics, please feel free to go to the REL Mid-Atlantic forum. And we'll be gearing up for another round of educator effectiveness webinars in 2015, so please stay tuned. You hopefully will receive one of our emails telling you about the upcoming event, so we encourage you to take your time today to provide the feedback in our survey. We do take that feedback into consideration when we're planning our upcoming events. So if there's a topic that we haven't touched on, one you're really interested in hearing more about, make sure that you note that on today's survey. And at this time, I will get you to the survey. And we are wrapped up for this afternoon, so thank you all for attending.